Some say a small village kept its nights measured by a single bell and a single lamp, and that the woman who would come to be called Mira lived where shadows gathered before dawn. She kept no flame of her own, not for want of longing, but for want of the craft to hold it, and neighbors told stories of her pale windows as if they were an old wound setting curiosity into motion. Listen close, for this is where the first question will be asked. When the cold months came, neighbors tucked bright tapers into their hearths and offered warmth as they always had. A candle here, a match of kind words there. Mira would accept with a bowed head and a promise she could not yet keep. She borrowed light the way one borrows a cup of sugar, casually, with a quick smile, and each small loan was marked only by memory and the soft clink of a returned cup, not by ink. But each borrowed candle began to live inside her house as a borrowed patience, and that patience would be tested. It is told that in that hamlet, people traded favors like coins and time like grain. And so Mira's debts were counted, not in metal, but in hours of light she owed to those who had given. She learned to measure her days by other people's kindness, and to assume that kindness would stretch endlessly like a well with no bottom. The first lessons slipped in gently. Time becomes a currency when light is not owned. Weeks turned like pages, and borrowed flames made faint nests in her rooms, each taper burning itself toward wicks that grew scrawled with other people's names in her mind. Those who lent did not speak of interest then, only of seasons and neighborly trust, and Mira learned a comfort that smelled of beeswax and trust misplaced. Yet evenings came where a single candle would not be enough, and the night learned to linger longer at her threshold. Once, leaning into a borrowed glow, Mira promised she would return more than she borrowed when spring came, and the words sounded like hope against the cold plaster. The neighbors nodded, believing spring would bring harvests, and with faith they tucked their candles back into their cupboards for a while longer. That night she closed her door and imagined tallying the light as one might tally seeds, and a seed thought forward to autumn. When the first frost came, neighbors began to whisper of records kept in the old ways, a ledger not of ink but of visits, of favors given, and of nights for which a light had been lent. Mira's count was generous in her memory, but thin in the ledger's quiet testimony, and the village elder would soon recall each candle like a bead on a rosary. The tiny record began to weigh on her as much as the chill. Interest in that village was not coins but requests, a loaf repaid, a patch mended, an evening spent when one could not. People asked gently at first, then more often, until their questions became the heat that revealed Mira's fragile stores. Each request for repayment required her time, and each hour given was an hour she no longer could use to earn her own light. The weight of owing grew like winter on a branch. Mira found evenings filled with other people's needs, mending, carrying, speaking for the older ones, and in all these she paid down pieces of light while her own rooms grew colder. She could have stopped borrowing, but habit is a small, loyal thief. The comfort of warmth had become a rhythm she could not simply step away from. As her obligations swelled, the cost of each borrowed candle felt like a longer walk to the communal well. One night, a neighbor knocked, asking for a favor in return for a long-ago candle, not with anger, but with the quiet insistence of seasons closing. Mira offered what she could: a warm stew, a repaired cloak, an evening of company, and for a time the ledger's line receded like mist. But the cost of those returns was measured in hours, and hours are by nature finite, and she discovered this truth as the sun retreated earlier each day. The cycle tightened. Then came a night when more candles were asked for than she could return in evenings and seam work, and the village's patience, once patient, turned to caution. Requests multiplied, and Mira found herself promising future days she did not possess, like pledging seeds before the harvest was seen. That night, the darkness at her windows felt less like the absence of light and more like an unpaid account waiting to be tallied. Some say the elder went to Mira with a small, hard truth. Light borrowed without plan invites a tomorrow of harsher reckonings, and he told it like a warning wrapped in kindness. He did not scold so much as look at the folds beneath her eyes and speak of the village's hearth, which can light many houses if tended well, but cannot be carried for long by one person alone. The moment demanded a choice of method, not just of will. Mira considered tending the communal flame as a way to balance her accounts, not with coin, but with time spent in service to a shared source, and yet the thought of labor without immediate private reward frightened her. She had grown used to the private comfort of borrowed candles and the soft illusion that her debts were small. The elder's proposal asked her to reorient toward the public good. Change is heavy when comfort has roots. At last she moved, and not in a dramatic rush but in patient steps. She brought water to the communal hearth, swept its hearthstones, and learned the schedules of tending that turned a flame into a steady sun for the village. In trading some of her borrowed hours for tending, she replaced a private candle with a shared fire from which light could be measured and owed in honest work. The small shift hardened into a new habit. As she worked, people counted small exchanges differently, and the ledger that once only listed lights now recorded time given openly and without shame. Neighbors began to accept her contributions as real repayment. Yet the time she spent mending could not be used for other personal pursuits, and some nights she found no light in the corners of her own home for the work she had done for all. The truth arrived. Repayment can restore balance, but may not return every lost hour. One particularly cold night, a storm blew out the village's higher lamps and left the hearth alone to hold the rest. And because Mira had tended that hearth, its flame answered many doors, including her own. Her labor had not bought her immediate wealth, but it had bought a steadier light when storms came. The village realized that shared effort could eclipse isolated borrowing. That night a hush fell, not of absence, but of quiet gratitude, and a new law of living began to breathe in the square. With seasons folding one into another, Mira's days settled into a rhythm of tending and receiving that felt less like a series of debts and more like an interwoven covenant. She still borrowed on rare evenings, for festivals or funerals, but those borrowings were accounted for openly and returned in time and labor rather than vague promises. The balance did not always feel even, but it felt honest, and honesty became a rare kind of light. Neighbors who once lent more hesitantly began to share again with measured grace, and children who watched Mira learned to ask not only for light, but for ways to tend it as well. The village taught the young that light could be borrowed, but it must never become a life built only on other people's flames. To do so is to live always in the shape of others' mercy. The lesson spread in lullabies and in the quiet of evening breadlines. Mira discovered that wealth in that place was not measured by possessions, but by the steadiness of one's contributions and the security of communal light, and she began to count her days by what she tended rather than what she briefly held. Time, she saw, is both a debt and a gift, depending on how it is spent, and the hardest truths were those she had to live before she could teach. in living the lesson, she found a quieter kind of wealth. Years later, people would look to Mira's darkened house no longer as sorrowful, but as a place that had learned to tend a larger flame. And she would sit by the window with a small taper and remember the nights she could not pay. She would tell visitors that the hardest repayment was learning to leave behind the illusion that someone else's light could be owned, reminding them softly that time once spent is never retrieved. The stories she told became seeds for others to plant. In the end, the parable closes simply. Mira learned that light borrowed without reckoning plunges one into darkness, but light tended together becomes a lasting glow, and time spent wisely becomes a treasury no storm can easily snuff out. And so the village became a little richer in ways that counted. And in that quiet conclusion lie the financial lessons we take with us into our own nights and days. Plan, pay, and tend. Take these lessons and let them be your steady flame.